Iberian Encounters, an online international conference sponsored by the Ateneo de Manila University in collaboration with the Centro de Humanidades, Universidade Nova de Lisboa, and the National Quincentennial Committee of the Republic of the Philippines. A pleasant afternoon to our guests and attendees in this Zoom room and in social media. It's now 4 p.m. Manila time, and we are streaming live on the conference YouTube channel and on Facebook pages. I am Dr. David Lozada III, Chair of the Department of History of the Ateneo de Manila University, and I will be your moderator for this afternoon's program. We are currently in part 1 of this month-long conference. Last Friday, the Department of History sponsored a panel on trade routes, and we had speakers from France, Italy, Portugal, and Mexico. Today, we continue the conversation with a panel on environment, seafaring, and shipbuilding. We are fortunate, Kate, to have with us this afternoon 2 distinguished scholars and educators. The first one is currently an affiliate with the Department of History of the Ateneo de Manila University, Dr. Gregory Bankoff. And our second guest comes all the way from Mexico City, Dr. Ivan Valdez Buvnov. Thank you, Dr. Buvnov, and thank you, Dr. Bankoff, for joining us despite the time differences. Allow me to explain the program flow. After my introduction, we will have a 15 to 20-minute presentation by Dr. Greg Bankoff. This is to be followed by a 15 to 20-minute presentation by Dr. Ivan Valdez Buvnov. The members of our audience from this Zoom room and those joining us in social media are encouraged to type in your questions in the chat box in the comment section of YouTube or on the Facebook live stream. You may type your questions while listening to our speakers. This will give us ample time to collect, and queue your questions that we receive. And I personally am looking forward to a lively discussion during the open forum. Allow me to introduce our first speaker. Our first guest is a historical geographer who focuses on the way societies interrelate with their environments over time, especially the way people adapt to frequent hazards. For the past 25 years, he has focused his research primarily on Southeast Asia, Central Asia, the Pacific, and the North Sea, seeking to combines archival analysis with fieldwork, community mapping, interviews, and focus groups. He is professor of environmental history at the University of Hull and has published extensively, including over 100 journal articles and book chapters. Among his publications include the co-authoring of the Red Cross's World Disaster Report for 2014, focusing on culture and risk, a companion edited volume entitled Cultures and Disasters, Understanding Cultural Framings in Disaster Risk Reduction in 2015. To present Winds of Chance, the meteorological contours of Iberian encounters with Asia in the days of sail, may we call on Dr. Gregory Bankoff.
Thank you very much, David. Okay. There we go. Thank you. What I would like to do is really pick up from some of the themes that we were discussing last Friday, and that is about lines of communication and sailing routes. But as I'm an environmental historian, I sort of take a different take upon that question, and I'm really interested in looking at the relationship between global atmospheric circulation, that is the way the winds blow around the oceans, and therefore basically the way in which currents flow, that and its relationship to the maritime empires of Europe from in the early modern period, right up all empires. But today, obviously, I'm just going to focus on the Iberian empires, which were, in a sense, the model that other maritime empires followed. And the point that I'd really like to make here is that the Iberian maritime empires of the early modern world were really shaped by those wind systems, shaped by that global atmospheric circulation. Before the conquistadors, the priests, company merchants, or colonial bureaucrats could subdue, evangelize, exploit, or administer their overseas possessions, they first had to be taken there, conveyed over the water in ships that were powered by the wind. Oceans were the highways, or I like to call them the marine ways of the past, upon which flowed the traffic of a pre-industrial age. But it's important to remember that water is only a medium, and referring to the activities that transpired across its expanses as simply maritime tends to obscure the proper consideration of the influence that winds and currents played. Wind constituted the primary source of energy available for long-distance transportation in the pre-industrial age. The rise of Iberian states to global dominance and world empires between the 15th and 17th centuries, as I said, is usually characterized as maritime, but should more fittingly be described as aeolian to denote their dependence on the prevailing patterns of atmospheric circulation. So in my paper this afternoon, I want to examine the role such meteorological factors have played in determining the outline, structure, and nature of Iberian seaborne empires in the age of sail. The imperial drive might have been motivated by a combination of God, gold, and glory, but its realization was largely determined by wind systems. As you can see from the map on your left-hand side here, the global wind patterns, the general circulation across the globe splits the surface winds of each hemisphere into three belts. The polar easterlies between 60 and 90 degrees of latitude, the prevailing westerlies between 30 to 60 degrees of latitudes, the tropical easterlies, so-called trade winds, between the equator and 30 degrees of latitude. And the winds are named according to the point of the compass from which they blow. And then you have in the middle the intertropical convergence, a narrow zone of alternating systems known as the doldrums. Superimposed upon this general circulation are, of course, many lesser disturbances in wind systems that are further complicated by hemispheric variations, one of the most well-known ones being, of course, ENSO or El Nino effect. If you look at the chart on the right-hand side, you can see that the oceans also have a complex circulatory system of currents that conform closely to the prevailing wind systems. Water piles up, in particular at the western margins of continents, with some deflected away from the land returning eastward via countercurrents and undercurrents, but the greater fraction of them form deep, narrow, fast-moving western boundary currents, the most important ones of which are the Gulf Stream in the Atlantic and the Kuroshio current, or La Corriente Negra, in the Pacific. If one starts to superimpose a map of Iberian imperia on the chart of atmospheric circulation over the oceans, what you see is a remarkable fit between the prevailing winds and currents and the form and extent of Iberian empires. The routes and landfalls largely dictated by trade winds and prevailing currents, and the timing and flow of commerce for outward and return passages to and from the metropolis. That is, ships' masters followed existing patterns of shipping born of long experience, and the territories and islands that served those routes were largely incorporated within the imperial mantle, especially the strategically located maritories, or way stations, I call them. For instance, the Atlantic islands would be one. And those that did not were basically left outside the initial imperial embrace. Any historical appreciation of the spread of Iberian colonialism and culture would be incomplete without due consideration that the role these meteorological phenomena have played, as there were literally winds of empire blowing backwards and forwards across the Atlantic, the Indian and Pacific Oceans during the days of sail. If we turn to the first of these maritime or Aeolian empires and look at the Portuguese. The wind systems along the Atlantic coast off the Iberian Peninsula and North Africa definitely favor ocean-going expeditions by sail. The two principal long-distance axes of Portuguese imperium were the Carreira do Brasil, the sea route between Lisbon and Brazil, and the Carreira de India, that between Lisbon and Goa via the Cape of Good Hope. Routes and sailing times on these voyages were determined by wind systems and currents in the Atlantic and by the seasonal monsoons in the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. India-bound now made for Madeira or the Azores, and then picked up the northeast trade winds for a run to the north coast of South America. And it was the appreciation of the circulatory wind patterns of clockwise rotating North Atlantic gyre and its oppositely gyrating South Atlantic counterpoint that had been gained in the 15th century that allowed these ships to make for the Cape and therefore into the Indian Ocean. They were able to catch the southwest winds around 20 degrees to the south in the southern hemisphere that took the ships around the Cape of Good Hope and into the Indian Ocean, where then their voyages were regulated by the monsoon winds. Voyages bound for Macau and Japan were subject then to a further set of monsoon winds. The Portuguese Empire, I think, is a striking example of the Ionian mechanics inherent in the imperium, whose geographical dispersion and dynamics were shaped and held together by wind and current. The paramount importance of the Atlantic islands as maritories for ships bound either for the west or the east, the importance of the Atlantic littoral of South America. One could point to the so-called accidental discovery of Brazil in 1500 and why Pernambuco became the site of the initial Portuguese settlement in the Americas because of its position as a sort of junction point, like a changing trains point between the North Atlantic and the South Atlantic. Why the Portuguese East African Empire was centered on Mozambique Island. The monsoon winds and why Goa was a natural pivotal nexus for trade and then became the seat of the Viceroyalty of the Estado do India. The conquest of Malacca in 1511 that secured the gateway to the Spice Islands and therefore the winds in the South China Sea. And even one could argue that the monsoon's winds also made Macau a natural destination of trade. Winds also govern the timing and place of exchange through the seasonal nature of the monsoons and the synergy between their alternations and the fixed winds of the Atlantic. I haven't got time in it today to talk much about the timing, but that was very important too. And ports of call on this global web of winds and currents made the Portuguese Empire as much an intra-Asian trade network as one between Europe and the Indian Ocean world. If we turn to the Spanish Ionian Empire, a unified Spain after 1492 enjoyed the same Ionian advantages as Portugal of seasonal variation in prevailing winds, and Castile then went on to colonize, of course, its own Atlantic maritory in the Canary Islands to serve as a pivotal role as a point of articulation between Europe and the Americas. Many Spanish seamen had participated in Portuguese expeditions and assimilated the same knowledge of winds and currents. For instance, Columbus had lived in the Azores. Columbus's route to the Caribbean ensured that the Spanish Main became the fulcrum of Spain's empire in the New World. Why the Caribbean? Because you'll look at it, if you look at it in terms of winds and currents, the there's a conflux of north and south equatorial currents that diffuse into the Caribbean basin. So the nexus of Spain's American empire was set, with Hispaniola and Cuba as the launch pads of exploration, conquest, and settlement in the New World, and the necessity of standing well to the north on leaving the West Indies before attempting a return Atlantic crossing on the westerly winds, therefore making Florida a necessity of colonial conquest and the site of the oldest European settlement stone structure in North America. But of course, Spain was also a Pacific empire. And the correlation between prevailing winds and Spanish colonization in the Pacific begins with Ferdinand Magellan's transversal of the Pacific between 1520 and 1521 on the southeast trade winds. His first landfall was Guam, and he then was sailed on, driven by the northeast trade winds, to reach the Philippines. The general circulation over the ocean set the pivotal reference points then of Spain's imperium in the Pacific. The Philippines as a base in the east, not Japan to the north or Indonesian islands to the south, and Guam as the primary way station on the return voyage. The need for a practical easterly passage led Felipe de Salcedo in 1565 to climb in a northeasterly direction until he encountered the westerlies and the Kuroshio current in the vicinity of around 37 to 39 degrees north, that then carried his ship across to the American coast, where he then followed the California currents south till he ended up or reached Acapulco again, and thus giving shape ready to Spain's imperium in the Pacific. But just as islands and peoples were eventually incorporated into the Spanish Empire depended on which way the wind blew, so those that were not were equally determined by patterns of general atmospheric circulation. For instance, the Spanish mariners' apparent inability to locate the Hawaiian Islands fails to consider their position in relation to prevailing wind patterns. Galleons dropping to 10 to 14 degrees north on leaving Acapulco effectively leave the islands in the middle of two sailing paths, and you can see that on the map there. Prevailing winds also established the beat or pulse at which the galleons operated. The departure from Manila in June depended on favorable winds for timing, and the return voyage from Acapulco by March to take advantage of the northeast trade. While of course I haven't had a lot of time to discuss this in more detail, but I think you can get the outlines of the Ionian mechanics that I'm talking about here. The overemphasis on human agency, I think, obscures the role that winds and currents have played in shaping the framework of Iberian empires in the early modern period. The Ionian molds fashioned these maritime imperia and materially affected the lands and peoples incorporated within them. And here again, in some of my research, I've been looking at the exchanges of people, for instance, where African slaves were actually transported to within the Americas. The plants and diseases that were also, of course, carried on these wind systems. A focus on winds and currents also contributes to a better understanding of the dynamics of change within this system by clearly denominating certain, what I call historical choke points, and certain pockets. What I mean by choke points are these maritories or way stations that I've been mentioned during my talk, where wind systems and currents converge, a place like Pernambuco, where you actually go from one wind system to another, where vessels waited or refitted, where merchandise was transshipped or traded, and where in fact wars and battles over their control were fought. Havana, Pernambuco, Table Bay, Goa, Malacca, Batavia, Guam, and the Atlantic Islands all rose to prominence and prosperity on the strength of the winds and currents that blew or flowed their way. But the creation of these supermarine marine ways across the oceans also created pockets or still waters, territories that lay between the winds and currents. Hawaii, the South Pacific Islands, southern Brazil, Chile, and much of the northeast Atlantic seaboard of North America were slow to be colonized or remained imperial backwaters till much later. So to conclude then, what I'm arguing here is the history of Iberian empires were in fact more Aeolian than maritime, and driven as much by global patterns of winds and currents as by any human agency. And if any of you are interested, I've written a couple of papers on this already. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bankoff. Our second guest is a full-time research fellow at the Instituto de las Investigaciones Históricas, Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México. His field of specialization is the history of Spanish naval shipbuilding in the Age of Sail, and he teaches military and naval history and historiography at both graduate and undergraduate levels. To present tons and tonnage in the construction of the Manila-Acapulco Galleons, a technological interpretation of the Philippine shipbuilding industry from the 16th to the mid-18th century, may we call on Dr. Ivan Valdez-Bubnov.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude to Professor Francis Navarro for inviting me to this event, to the Ateneo de Manila University for hosting it, and of course to the Centro de Humanidades Nova Lisboa, and to all of you for your presence. My purpose here is to discuss a series of technical concepts utilized in the Spanish shipbuilding industry from the 16th to the 18th centuries. These concepts were initially developed in the Iberian Peninsula in order to define the size and cargo capacity of trading ships. This function was directly linked to the taxation of trade, to the definition of freight charges and port fees, and to determine the commercial value of the ships themselves. It also had military implications. When the crown needed to hire merchant ships to constitute an armada, it relied on these concepts to establish the amounts to be paid to their owners. As these concepts became the subject of royal shipbuilding legislation, they were used to standardize shipbuilding in all Spanish dominions, and they became the standard units of measurement used to define the size of royal warships. Nevertheless, it cannot be assumed that they were applied or even accepted simultaneously in all regions of the Spanish Empire. The story of how and when these concepts were imposed on the Philippine shipbuilding industry and what effect they had on the taxation of the Manila-Acapulco trade route is the subject of this presentation. Well, traditionally, merchant ships have been classified according to their cargo capacity, that is, the volume of their hull below the main deck. This volume was initially estimated according to the number of containing units like wine barrels or cartloads that could be fitted inside the hull, or by mimicking these units by empirical methods. It could also be obtained by measuring the 5 basic dimensions of the hull: length, keel, beam, depth, and floor, according to the linear units of measurement utilized in the cultural and mercantile context in which the ship operated. The figures thus obtained were then used in arithmetical operations aiming to account for the varying shapes of the hull, like its narrowing and upward shapes towards bow and stern, the spaces between decks, or other features of the deadworks. This classification, based on cargo capacity, was later transferred to warships, as they were initially merchantmen converted or used for war. Well, here we have a 16th century draft which shows these measurements and how they were taken. Since we don't have too much time, I will leave it just on the screen so it can be consulted later on. The important part here is the linear units of measurement used in the Spanish shipyards. the Codo de Ribera, made of 2/3 of vara castellana, 2 pies or 24 pulgadas, which has a contemporary equivalence of 574 millimeters. And it was mainly used in the Cantabrian shipyards, Guipúzcoa, Vizcaya, and Santander. There were other types of codos, which are not of our interest here. But what is important to keep in mind is that the definition of the codo, however precise or imprecise, directly affected the calculations of hull volume. Now, the volumetric units of measurement are more complex. The quintal, composed of 100 libras castellanas, was an unit of weight used mainly in the Mediterranean and had a loosely defined volumetric equivalent called quintalada. There were also the tonel or tonel macho, which was the equivalent of 2 barrels of wine of 27.5 arrobas and was used in Cantabria and Andalusia since the 15th century. Well, by the mid of the 16th century, the cargo capacity of the Indus-trade ships was registered in toneladas. The tonelada was defined by Johan Escalante de Mendoza in 1575 as 2 pipas de 27 arrobas de las que se hacen en el arrabal de la carretería en Sevilla, 2 barrels of wine of 27.5 arrobas. And the number of these volumetric units, toneladas de carga, that could be fitted inside the hull of a ship, was called tonelaje, tonnage. There were other meanings for tonelaje, as, for example, in the complete cargo capacity of a fleet, but we will not dwell on that today. These concepts gradually became more complex. Tonelaje also became the product of the amount of toneles that could be fitted inside the hull of a single ship, plus an addition of 20% over that amount. The product was used to define the amounts paid to ship owners whose ships were hired or seized by the crown for naval service, called sueldo por tonelada. And the addition was conceived as a compensation for the varying shapes of the hull. The resulting volumetric and fiscal concept was named tonelada de cuenta, and it was different from the tonelada de carga. But its meaning was, as time passed, simplified simply as tonelada. However, the mere volumetric estimation of the hull on toneles was also called tonelada. So there is plenty of room for confusion in contemporary sources. And we have to keep that in mind when we study Spanish shipbuilding in the age of sail. In many cases, it's difficult or impossible to know exactly what was meant by these concepts from a single historical source, and the context becomes crucial in order to understand them. Well, both systems were standardized in 1590. The Codo de Ribera Cantábrico became the standard unit of linear measurement to be used in the shipyards of the whole Spanish Empire, whereas the tonelada de carga of 8 cubic codos, defined in turn by the Codo de Ribera, became the standard unit of volumetric measurement. And this was valid, of course, for the whole of the empire, including the Indies, so in principle, the Philippines as well. At the beginning of the 17th century, further technological standardization was achieved with a very detailed shipbuilding legislation called Ordenanzas, of which the last issue was printed in 1618. They were based in these systems, approved in 1590, and they included arithmetical formulas for the calculation of cargo capacity in toneladas or volume in the hold. The Spanish word for that is arqueo. And a specialized arqueo formula was issued in 1613 and added to the 1618 edition of the Ordenanzas. Well, here you have the description of the formulas presented in a more or less narrative manner, and I will not dwell on this because we don't have too much time. The point here is, what about the Pacific? Did these systems apply in the shipyards of the Spanish Pacific? Well, the answer is quite complex. the concept of tonelada was indeed utilized by the Crown to define the amounts of Asian products that could be legally introduced in Acapulco in each travel of the Manila galleons. For this purpose, there were instrucciones, shipbuilding and trade instructions, issued by the Crown in 1571, 72, and 73, which ordered the Manila Treasury to keep 3 to 4 galleons in permanent service. And their tonnage was set in 1593 at 300 toneladas each, with a value in cargo of 250,000 pesos and a return of 50,000. The amount of ships in service was modified in 1602, but the same cargo of 300 tons was kept by dividing it in each one of the ships in service. And in 1604, the number of ships was increased, and it was specified that they could have a maximum tonnage, that is size, of 200 tons each. They were very small indeed. For comparison, by that time, there are reports of ships sailing from Manila of a size of up to 2,000 tons. That means that the royal legislation was in practice surpassed tenfold. So what kind of toneladas were these? A plausible hypothesis is that they were toneladas de carga and not toneladas de cuenta, because the Manila galleons were, in fact, royal warships and not merchantmen hired for naval service. So the concept of tonelada de cuenta would make no sense in this context. And it is safe to assume that the toneladas mentioned in royal legislation were indeed volumetric tons. But there was also a fiscal concept of tonelada used in the Spanish shipyards of the Philippines. In 1994, Carmen Yuste defined it as the amount of money paid for a tonelada de repartimiento, that is, a terminal space in the hold of one of the galleons. Again, it is safe to assume that these toneladas were volumetric units, analogous to a toneladas de carga standardized by the Crown in 1590, based on the col de Rivera and the tonel of 2 pipas of 27.5 arrobas, or 8 cubic codos. There is room for confusion because there is proof that the col Castellano and not the col de Rivera was in use at the early stages of the Trans-Pacific run in the ships built in the coasts of Spanish America. And on the other hand, there is also proof that the size of warships used in different Pacific naval theaters was registered in toneladas without further detail. It is important at this early stage of the Trans-Pacific run not to overestimate the importance of these measurements, because between the 1580s and the 1600s, the pancada was in use, that is a system for bulk purchases, which presumably did not have any effect on the tonnage of ships. But, and here's the main point, from 1621 onwards, and maybe earlier, the loading of merchandise in the Manila galleons was regulated by a new freight concept, the piezas. This was a loosely defined piece of packaging with different shapes, sizes, and weight, and received different names. Cajones, medios cajones, etc. I leave it here in the screen for you to consult later, because we don't have too much time to dwell on that. The important part is that freight charges were calculating according to the number of piezas that could be fitted inside the hold of a galleon. And they were agreed in a meeting between the Manila merchants and the officers of the Royal Exchequer. In 1637, the piezas were standardized according to the smaller unit of 40 medios fardillos, which was accorded a fiscal value of 12 pesos, the flete de mar, as freight charges. And this unit of 40 medios fardillos was considered a tonelada. So here we have a completely different concept of tonelada, different to that used in the Spanish Atlantic. other types of piezas were taxed separately. From the 1630s, the Crown initiated a series of attempts to control the Manila-Acapulco trade route and to limit the independence of the merchant elites of Mexico City and Manila. And there were two obvious ways to achieve this. One was to limit the size of the galleons in order to limit the volume of merchandise sent to Acapulco. This, however, required controlling the Philippine shipbuilding industry, which was not easy to do, as the shipwrights were, in fact, allied with the Manila merchant class. The other way was to control the definition of the tonelada, to control the manner in which it was applied by the shipwrights, and to supervise its taxation. This also generated resistance, as we shall see. The merchants of Mexico City and Manila and their parts started to act as a guild, seeking to defend their privilege by judicial means. And of course, they aimed to control the Philippine shipyards and the tonnage of the Manila-Acapulco galleons. In 1662, the Tribunal de Cuentas de la Ciudad de México imposed on the Philippine shipyards a new nomenclature for the piezas in the following manner: fardillo, frangote, etc. But this reform was not ratified in principle by the Indies Council. But by 1667, the council took the side of the merchants and ordered the Tribunal de Cuentas to return to the old manner, guardarse el estilo que antes se hubiera observado, which seems to be the tonelada of 40 medios fardillos with a freight value of 12 pesos each. The Mexican Tribunal de Cuentas attacked again in 1677, requesting precise definitions of the piezas and their equivalence in toneladas. Again, the Manila merchants refused to obey, arguing that el no haber remitido razón de las piezas que hacían toneladas fue por no hacer acto contrario a la inmemorial posesión en que la ciudad estaba de no pagar fletes de mar por la cuenta cúbica como se pretendía en México. This basically means that the Manila merchants were refusing to utilize the concept of tonelada standardized by the royal legislation in 1590. And they argued to be in possession of an ancient privilege of using their own systems of measurement and accounting of the toneladas. In 1682, the Tribunal de Cuentas ordered Manila to provide measurements of the piezas in use. Crucially, it also decreed a new volumetric and fiscal definition of the tonelada, according to a precise number of piezas for each tonelada. Y por lo que toca a los fletes de mar, se regulan 9 piezas de las referidas por una tonelada, y estas paguen 44 ducados. So, the tonelada used in the Spanish Pacific was an equivalent of 9 piezas and had a fiscal value of 44 ducados. And this was endorsed by the Audiencia de México in 1684. The first ship that was gauged by this method was the Santo Niño in 1685, and this produced a total freight value that was considered excessive by the Manila merchants, and they continued to resist the order to provide precise measurements of the piezas. And at this point, at the end of the 17th century, the Crown intervened, taking the side of the Mexican exchequer. In 1697, a Real Cédula ordered the galleons to be built with a 400-ton limit. That is very small again. And there is positive evidence that the ships built during this period, late 17th century, the early 18th, were built up to 1,000 tons, from 800 to 1,000 tons. So over twice the size of the limitation on tonnage imposed in 1697. Also, it was issued a new definition for the different types of piezas, which you have here on the screen. But again, the Manila merchants refused to accept the cubic calculation of tonnage and sought to defend their ancient privileges. And which is very important, they also requested permission to build galleons of up to 1,200 tons. When the Bourbon dynasty reached the throne in 1700, the Indies Council and the Mexican Viceroyalty increased their pressure on the trans-Pacific trade. And the central aspect of this policy was the standardization of Philippine shipbuilding. The instrucciones were updated in 1702 with a new value set for the products sent to Acapulco, and a new maximum on the size of the galleons was set at 500 tons, which was repeated in 1712 and updated in 1720 with an increase to 560 tons. And in 1720, the Crown issued new denominations for the piezas. The Manila merchants replied, demanding an increase in the value of exported goods to 500,000 pesos with $1 million in return, and asked for permission to build ships of 900 tons. But crucially, in 1723, the Proporciones de las Más Esenciales de Antonio de Gastañeta, that is the new shipbuilding legislation issued by Philip V, was received in Manila. And it was ordered that it had to be followed as a new shipbuilding ordenanza. And in fact, it was. The ships built during the 1730s actually followed that size limit. The Nuestra Señora de Covadonga and Nuestra Señora del Pilar, in fact, were the two Gastañeta type ships that were built during this period. Here you have Gastañeta's drafts for 70-gun ships, not the type that was built in the Philippines, but it gives you an idea of its aspect. In 1724, the Crown attempted to end the controversy regarding the piezas and toneladas by ordering that the value of the merchandise shipped to Acapulco was defined by written declarations called facturas, with a maximum of 4,000 piezas allowed in the hold of each galleon, but without specifying their volumetric meaning. In 1731, the merchants of Manila announced their decision to return to their old ways of measuring the piezas and offered to pay compensation in case the value was exceeded. And in 1734, the 500-ton maximum for the galleons was ratified by the Crown. And the 1724 regulation for the piezas was ratified as well. However, in 1734, the shipbuilding elites of Manila published a nautical treatise on the Navegación Especulativa y Práctica by Joseph González Cabrera Bueno, which included scantlings and measurements for the construction of two-decked ships of almost 1,000 tons. That is, it doubled the size of royal legislation. And it also included a formula to calculate volume in the hold, archeo, which can be synthesized as you can see here. And here you have my interpretation of this ship, made together with Professor Jorge Loizaga. And well, it might not be surprising that during the 1740s and 1750s, the size of the ships built in the Philippines started to grow again, reaching 2,000 tons with the Santísima Trinidad, launched in 1752. In that year, the Marqués de la Ensenada, the naval minister, started to intervene much more directly the shipbuilding industry on the of the Philippines, and actually asked the Santísima Trinidad to be raised, that is, that its top deck was eliminated to limit its size. And crucially, in 1760, that is during the period of Julián de Arriaga as Minister of the Navy, the Atlantic shipbuilding legislation based on the Código de Ribera Cantábrico and the Vara Castellana, that is the legislation approved for the whole of the empire in 1590 was imposed on the Philippine shipyards. And the crucial point here is that the piezas were finally equated to 1 cubic codo on a one-to-one basis, making an equivalence of 8 piezas for each tonelada of 8 cubic codos. This means a complete standardization with the practices of the Spanish Atlantic. And also a specific tax value was assigned to these new Pacific toneladas in the manner that you can see here on this table. So the year 1760 marks the point in which the Philippines shipbuilding industry was completely standardized according to the practices of the Spanish Atlantic. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Buvnov. Now it's time for us to pose questions to our speakers. I invite the conference participants in this Zoom room to please type your questions in the chat box or to raise your hands so I can call you in case you want to ask questions directly to our speakers. And I'd like to begin the open forum by asking some of the questions that have already been sent to me earlier. And I'd like to begin by the question that's directed to Dr. Bankoff. This is a question that was sent to me from Professor Paulo Pinto. And his question, Dr. Bankoff, is this. Don't you think Luanda and Angola, which was the main staple of the Portuguese Empire in Western Africa, okay, even in the long term, was an exception to the general scheme that you've shown?
Yes, thank you for that. No, I don't actually. I think it very much conforms to the location. If you think ships going down the African coast or going leaving Spain or Portugal heading south can only go so far. So I mean, of course, trying to get further down the African coast was a very big impediment for a long time for Portuguese ships in the 15th century. So they was learning to go far out to the southwest before coming back in that they actually managed to be able to round Africa. And that would then take them logically along the coast there towards Angola, well, certainly towards Luanda and Angola along there. Or alternatively, coming through the South Gyre, your winds would take you that way too. If you carried on, it would take you to along the coast there. And I'm not 100% sure which way ships went to Angola at the time, but the wind systems perfectly mirror those locations. The exceptions, I think, are northeast, especially the northeast coast of North America. I think that's the really big exception, and I have an argument for that too, in the sense that actually because they were Puritans and Quakers trying to, in a sense, escape metropolitan control, that in fact they were hiding. It was a safe pocket for them to be in, because the return trip from North America to Europe is very direct, but to sail to the northeast coast of America by sailing ship is extremely hard. It involves lots of digressions and very timely. So I don't think that one is an exception.
Thank you, Dr. Bankoff. Our next question is directed to Professor Buvnov. It was sent to me in one of the chat boxes. Considering that these merchantmen were simply converted and used, okay, as naval vessels for war, how effective were they as surface combatants? It is understood that they were trade vessels, merely converted to combat other naval forces. How effective were they as surface combatants in the age of sail?
Well, that really depends on the context and the characteristics of the ships used for battle. But what we must bear in mind here is that the purpose of the royal shipbuilding legislation under the Habsburgs, the Ordenanzas of 1607, 1613, and 1618, and all of the additions of the 17th century were aimed at making the ships efficient, both in commerce and war. And actually, this imposed certain features that were not easily acceptable by the merchants of the Spanish Empire, because in fact it limited cargo capacity. It aimed at making, for example, faster ships, and also at providing them with superstructures to mount infantry and extra guns. So the royal shipbuilding legislation in this, from this perspective, was very efficient. And from a Pacific perspective, there are many reports on the efficiency and the power of the Manila galleons when used as warships, not only because of the hardwoods with which they were built, but also because of their impressive size. They were successful in repulsing the Dutch on more than one occasion, and even when they were captured, like, for example, the Covadonga by Anson in the 1740s, they put up a tremendous resistance. So I would say that the Spanish system of mixing military and commercial characteristics in the shipbuilding industry was rather efficient, and it did not cease to be so until the advent of new naval tactics in the second half of the 17th century, and when they were fully adopted by the rivals of the Spanish monarchy during the 18th. That means the line of battle and the specialized man of war. So in all, I would say that it was a very, very efficient technological policy.
Thank you, Ivan. Our next question is for Dr. Bancroft. It was sent to me via the Facebook messengers. The question goes like this, Greg. Seafarers from our side of the world also read the winds. Is there a fundamental difference in the way the Southeast Asian seafarers appraised and applied the winds compared to their Western counterparts?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. And I guess why I focus on European maritime empires, as of course the wind systems were used by, the Indian Ocean was an Arab ocean, Southeast Asian, and of course at certain times Chinese navigators were sailing all over these oceans, depending very much on wind systems. And I think you could use the same Ionian mechanics to look at that as well. What is different about European maritime empires is that they're sailing in all oceans. And therefore the synergy between having to relate one wind system to another becomes very important. And I think that's the big difference there. Not that, of course, that they weren't just, that other people weren't using wind systems, and of course knew for centuries. And in fact, actually, a lot of early Portuguese and Spanish knowledge of wind systems comes from the Arabic anyhow. Their knowledge of seafaring was derivative to a certain extent anyhow. But it's the scale of European maritime empires that I think they're looking at a global system of winds and utilizing it, as I said, like changing the metro from one station to another, and that these certain way stations, these maritories, become places where you get off one wind system and you get onto another. And because of that, that's where those interactions happen. So my next bit of research is actually examining those maritories, focusing in on this. I mean, you know, my hunch, and I don't know yet, is if you start looking at naval battles and think that you will find them concentrated around certain maritories. Then there's a whole question of fresh water, because water, of course, is the other vital element that ships need on these systems. And, you know, where did they pick up the fresh water from? These have to be related to wind systems as well.
Thank you, Greg. Our next question is for Professor Puvnov. Were there any design innovations that resulted from knowledge, skills, or materials that the Spaniards learned from local shipbuilders?
Yes, but especially for minor units, smaller ships, like Vintas, Caballos de Mar, and many other types, because vernacular craft were extremely proficient at reaching high speeds, and they were very maneuverable. So the Spanish were impressed with the skills of indigenous shipbuilding since the very beginning. There are many reports on that since Pigafetta. Many observers reported on the high quality of local shipbuilding, and they certainly used local laborers to build the galleons. But the galleons themselves were European ships. That's without question. Of course, there's a lot of work to be done in order to understand if other influences were manifest in the actual construction of the hull. For example, the type of joints used to link the structural components of the hull. But in principle, we could say that the galleons were built on according to the Spanish traditions. Having said that, the quality of the tropical woods found in the Philippines was an extremely important feature that was praised as well since the beginning of since the origins of the Spanish shipbuilding industry in the Pacific. And it was an asset that was highly valued by the shipwrights of the Philippines.
Thank you, Ivan. I'd like to turn the floor over to the members of the Zoom room, the participants. Is there anyone in the Zoom room who would like to ask a question to our two panelists? You may raise your hand. Paulina, okay, you have the floor. You may ask your question. Yes, Paulina, you may ask your question now. Oh, Paulina is muted. Can someone?
Okay, thank you. Sorry, there was a problem with the microphone. Yeah, a question to Ivan, according to the woods, to the maderas, because there are many documents in which the Spanish praise the Asian woods from the Philippines and from Indonesia, for example, and Malaysia. And I wanted to ask you if the galleons that were made with Asian woods have a longer lifetime than those that were constructed with American woods. Is it possible to confirm this? And another question is, what was the average of lifetime of a galleon, approximately? And I have another question to Professor Bankov. I remember have read this book of Anthony Reid about Southeast Asia and the age of commerce. And one of the subtitles of a book is The Lands Below the Winds, Southeast Asia as the land or the lands below the winds. And I wanted to know if winds were more important in this region of the world for seafaring activities than other regions like Africa, as Paulo Pinto asked, or the Caribbean. I mean, more than atmospherical characteristics. I don't know if atmospherical characteristics are more focused on this region in Southeast Asia. I don't know. That's why I asked the question. Thank you.
Perhaps we can begin first with Dr. Buvnov. Can perhaps answer Paulina first, then after that will be followed by Greg's response to Paulina's question. Ivan, you have the floor.
Thank you. Yes, sailing ships built with properly seasoned tropical hardwoods could last for many decades. One example would be the Guerrero, built in the mid-18th century in Havana, and which fought at the Battle of Trafalgar. So they could last for a very, very long time if the woods were properly seasoned and properly built. So in principle, that should apply to the Manila galleons. Having said that, there are many reports throughout the decades, throughout the whole of the 18th century and even into the 18th, that the ships built in the Philippine shipyards were of very bad quality, and that they lasted no more than 4 years in service before requiring major careenings. Of course, this could be the result of improper seasoning of the timbers, but I have reflected a lot on these questions. I have published a few articles on this, and I believe that there were, in fact, political and financial reasons for criticizing the quality of the galleons. One of them was the necessity to circumvent royal legislation, which, as I have said in my presentation, was aimed at limiting the size of the galleons in order to control the amount of merchandise that was shipped to Acapulco. So the crown wanted small ships. And there was a general interest within the elites of Manila and the shipwrights of the Philippine shipyards to produce much larger galleons. And I think one of the ways to achieve this was to subcontract galleon construction outside the Philippines, in India, in Cambodia, and in Siam, in Thailand. And there were very serious attempts to do this throughout the 17th century and during the 18th century as well. So we could almost say that there was a consistent policy of subcontracting the construction of galleons outside the Philippines in other Asian countries. And the main justification for this was the quality of the woods. The report said that the timbers were of very bad quality, and that the galleons could not last more than 4 or 5 years in service. And so it was necessary to build the ships with better timbers in India or in Cambodia. And we can find these arguments throughout the decades in the correspondence of the governors of the Philippines. It's difficult to believe that the timbers were that bad back then. So most likely, in fact, what they wanted was to build ships far away from royal supervision to control the size of the galleons and to increase the level of unregistered merchandise to be shipped to Acapulco. That's my hypothesis, at least. Excuse me. Also, somebody asked another question regarding the reasons here in the chat. I can see it now, regarding the reasons for limiting the tonnage of the galleons. This was a consistent technological policy followed by the Crown regarding the production of ships in the Philippines. And of course, the main reason for this was to prevent the shipment of unregistered merchandise into Acapulco. which was perceived as an unduly competition with the monopoly of transatlantic trade. So the problem of the size of the galleons was in fact related to the competition between the elites of Manila and Mexico City and the merchant elites of Seville and Cadiz. And this problem was also present in all sorts of reports and the correspondence of governors throughout the 17th and the 18th centuries. So the size of galleon was important for the balance of trans-Pacific trade. But again, military considerations also justified building very large ships. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivan. Let's give Dr. Bankoff the opportunity to answer Paulina's question.
Yeah, just before I do that, Dave, just to sort of a follow-on question to Ivan on that. I thought that certain Philippine woods were very good at resisting the teredo, the shipworm, and that made they excluded a natural oil that resisted. So was that not an important factor in the choice of Philippine woods?
It certainly was. As I said, I think that there was really no intrinsic problem with the quality of the timbers, but rather there were political and mercantile interests which were disguised as a technical criticism on the quality of the woods. So I don't think that the woods were bad at all. As I said, some ships built in Havana with caoba, mahogany, lasted for several decades in naval service, and they fought in battles decades before, after they were built. So that must have applied to the Manila galleons as well. If it did not, it was probably because there were many interests which aimed at transferring the Philippine shipbuilding industry to other Asian countries to give the merchants elites of Manila more technical control over the technical characteristics of the galleons.
I mean, I've been doing some work much later, of course, Ivan, in the 19th century, but I mean, what struck me there was the amount of damage to local shipping, not the large ships, but to smaller ships and crafts by typhoons and things, and the extraordinary amount of wood that was actually probably being lost and replaced. And I don't know the extent, if we start going back to the 17th century of local shipping that there would have been at that time. Anyhow, so I'm sorry. Let me answer Paulina's question before I get carried away on this one. It's a very good point. I mean, yeah, the Nanyang, the lands below the winds. Yeah. I mean, I'm actually not 100% sure what that is a reference to, but my hunch would be is below the southwest and northwest monsoon winds. It's the lands below those wind systems from the Chinese perspective, but I'm not 100% sure why it was called the land below the winds, but I suspect it's probably something to do with the monsoons in the South China Sea. No, there's nothing intrinsic. The wind systems are different in every ocean, and if you look at the circuitry pattern around them, they're complex. But there's no one where the winds play or the currents play. And remember, the currents are just as important here as in a sense the winds. Though of course the currents are being driven by the winds in most cases. There's nothing inherently more complex in one area than another. I mean, except when you get to more inland oceans, and here I would look at the Mediterranean as a very interesting thing, but also the Spanish Main, the Caribbean, which was often called the American Mediterranean, you know, because of the intricate way in which wind systems and currents flow there. Perhaps there you start getting a more complex system because of the way in which the water body is contained, almost contained within its geographical mass, and how the wind systems acted there. But You know, if you look at the Caribbean, for instance, it's really interesting when you look at the position of how the currents come in at the Yucatan Peninsula, how they, you know, go around on the one hand, the whole sort of Mediterranean, the Caribbean basin, but another stream goes and takes you basically to Havana, and that's why Havana becomes such an important linchpin in terms of its position on the wind system. And then how do you leave the Caribbean to go out on the northwest, you know, to get the Gulf Stream and out on that system, out to get back to Europe too. So the positioning of places is really important on these wind systems, but I don't think anyone is more inherently complex or played a larger role than others. Yeah, it's just what you focus on. As I said, you come back to Europeans because they were looking at the system on a global scale rather than, and that was the first. Nobody else had really done that before, looking at this global system of winds.
Thank you, Dr. Bankoff, and thank you, Paulina, for your question. I'd like to read a comment and a question that's also directed to Dr. Bankoff from Dr. Patricia Dacudao of the Department of History. And her comment and question goes like this. Interesting discourse on winds and currents, Dr. Bankoff. It does support the pattern of early Spanish expeditions, Magellan, Villalobos, etc. Often entered the Philippines from between Caraga in northeast Mindanao to the Samar coasts of the Western Pacific, and why they were kept from returning to Mexico or Spain eastward from the Philippines in those early years. Why, though, did the Spaniards not have their first settlements in these places, unlike the other islands like Goa in the Indian Ocean and those of other islands in the Caribbean?
Yeah, it's interesting, but of course, the first early Spanish settlements were in the Visayas, at any rate. I mean, not at Manila, and that Manila was good question as to. I suspect there. I'm speculating, but I mean, you know, the Bay of Manila, of course, is such a good harbor, and because you have to eventually go on a northeastern. I mean, you have to go on a northeastern route to get back to the Americas, or to go to the Americas, if you're from the Galleons' perspective. That Manila was a good station, but I don't actually. I mean, that's a really interesting question to actually see to what extent did wind systems, if at all, play any role in the choice of Manila. I don't know.
Thank you, Dr. Bankoff. We have a question for Ivan. This is a question from Anna Melinda from our Zoom room. Did the Spanish galleons report the problems of shipworms that ate through the hulls of ships? How did they address this problem? Okay, as Dampier mentions this problem in his travel account.
Yes, but especially in the galleons that were built in the coasts of Spanish America. In fact, there are not that many reports on this problem produced by the Philippine shipyards or the government of Manila. But that, of course, doesn't mean that it did not exist. There are reports that some ships that were built in America, when they reached the Pasig River, were infested in a very short time with the Teredo navalis and other barnacles and etc. And I suppose that this happened to many ships as well, but I really can't answer exactly why. I don't know the types of timbers with which the American built ships were produced. And what I can say is that these reports are not that common for the ships built on the Philippines. I have not found many of those reports for the Spanish galleons built on the Philippines. So I really cannot say with precision.
Thank you, Ivan. We have a question for Dr. Bankoff. Was the discovery of the Black Stream in the Pacific, Kuroshio, predicted by Iberian navigators around the mid-16th century? I mean, the knowledge of sea streams at that time allowed to define the existence of such a current, or else was a transmission of information by was the transmission of information by Asians to the Iberians?
Well, given the conversation about maps, that Japanese map last Friday, which was really an eye-opener to me, I had no idea that such a thing existed. I mean, as far as I'm aware, and I'm not an early modern historian, so I'm you know, 19th and 20th century. I believe that the system of winds was predicted, and that's why Salcedo went to the north to try and find the wind system that he expected was there. Now, that strikes me as being, I don't know whether there was any prior knowledge from Japanese sources or other sources, that Asian sources, that might have encouraged that route. But perhaps there are other people in the audience who are better placed to actually answer that question than I am.
Thank you, Greg. We have another question for Ivan. This is from Joseph Hill. It's actually two questions, and I'm going to ask it in one swoop. It's interesting to learn about the various ways in which the galleon trade merchant elites of both sides resisted official legislation. So the first question is, what happened to these groups when the galleon trade ended? And a follow-up question, another question related to that by Joey Fernandez. How do toneladas then relate to tonnage today?
We must bear in mind that one of the aims of the Bourbon reforms in the Philippines in the second half of the 18th century was to develop the local industry and the economy instead of keeping it dependent on the Manila-Acapulco trade. So yes, there was a reconversion of the merchant elites to other activities, but we must also bear in mind that, in fact, the contacts with Spanish American, with Acapulco and other ports continued well after the independence. So it was not really completely severed. I would say that the chronological frontier should be placed around the 1760s, not only because of the tonelada reforms, which I have described in my presentations, but also because the Spanish Navy began to act as a direct link between the ports of the Iberian Peninsula, Cadiz, and the Philippines by using the old Portuguese route. So there was a much more direct state intervention in the whole of the Philippine shipbuilding maritime system after that period, after the seven years war, which was begun, of course, with the arrival of the 60-gun ship El Buen Consejo, which was sorely rejected by the Manila elites. And excuse me, what was the second question again? Could you repeat, David, please, the second question?
Yes, Ivan. The second question is the question is about how do the toneladas equate to the notion of tonnage today?
Right. Well, the equivalence is 920 kilograms. So it is very close to the contemporary metric ton, 920 kilos.
Thank you, Ivan, for the clarification. May I ask Father Tony De Castro to articulate his question? I think it's directed to Dr. Bankoff. Father Tony, would you like to read your question aloud and direct it to Greg? Father Tony, are you with us? At any rate,
Who wants to unmute?
Yeah.
oh yes, can someone
Okay.
please unmute? Oh yes, thank you.
Excuse me, David. Yeah, because I was not able to unmute myself earlier.
Yes,
Can you
Father
hear me
Tony.
now?
Yes, we can hear you, Father. You may
Okay.
ask your question.
Yes, I was trying to unmute myself earlier, but I wasn't able to. Okay. Basically, it has something to do with the wind patterns, because it seems that the galleon trade from Manila to Acapulco could take place only during certain times of the year. But it seems that the reverse side, from Acapulco to Manila, there was no such difficulty with the wind patterns. It seemed to be a consistent line going from the Americas to Asia. So I was wondering, so first of all, something about the wind patterns changing during the year. But second, was communication then between Mexico and the Philippines, shouldn't have that been more, was that totally dependent on the galleon ships themselves? Or was there in fact communication between Mexico and the Philippines, let's say throughout the year? Because the wind patterns going from the Americas to Asia seemed to be consistent. There was no dramatic changes, any dramatic change in that direction. Perhaps Professor Greg would like to say something.
Yeah, thank you, Father. In principle, you're right, but actually, ships usually had to leave Acapulco by about March to ensure that they had the trade winds blowing all the way across at equal strength. So otherwise, by the time they got to around Guam, they could find themselves in being much delayed in terms of being able to reach the Philippines. So there was, in a sense, a timing that ships tried to leave Acapulco by March. But then you have to superimpose upon that something that I didn't really have time to go into, which was all the sort of, how should I put it, other features of wind systems or climatological phenomena that may affect actual routes. So, for instance, there's a period in the early 17th century, from it's early to mid 17th century, about 1630 to about 1670, where you have very prominent El Nino phenomena. And that, again, also delays the voyage, or can delay the voyage. So there are a host of other reasons that actually may, then you have the typhoon seasons imposed upon that. And if you're, once you get to Guam, if you're later in the year, then you are much more likely to hit the typhoons. So there were other factors that were actually encouraging ships to leave Acapulco by about March at the latest, if they could help it.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you, Father Tony, for your question. We have another question for Ivan. This is from our social media partners. Did the decision to limit ship size make voyages at the expense of safety and even efficiency? This is in the context of revenue generation.
In principle, yes, because a smaller ship is less safe than a larger one. And also, a larger ship is able to carry more provisions and more water than a smaller one. And this was, in fact, one of the arguments that the Philippine shipwrights utilized in their debates with the officers of the Royal Exchequer, that ships had to be built in very big sizes in order to resist the trans-Pacific voyage. So this was very, very explicit. It was argued that smaller ships were simply not safe enough. And also, of course, there were military considerations that operated in the same manner. A bigger ship always had the advantage over a smaller one in resisting artillery fire, and also in mounting infantry in the superstructures, in the upper structures of the hull. So yes, in general, big ships were considered more safe and better in battle than the smaller ones. And of course, it was one of the arguments with which the royal limitations on tonnage and size were resisted.
Thank you, Ivan, for your answer. We have more questions from our social media partners and our platforms. But before I go to the other questions, I would like to ask if there are any members of the Zoom panel, our Zoom group right now, the participants of the conference, who would like to direct their questions to Professor Buvnov or to Professor Bancroft. If there is none, I'd like to read the other questions that were sent to us. This is quite extensive, so I do hope Professor Buvnov and Professor Bancroft, you have a glass of water beside you. Okay, so the first question is, the next question is directed to Dr. Bancroft. These are actually questions from Mr. Joey Fernandez, and he's asking basically two things, but it's all related to currents. So I'd like to ask both questions in the same breath. Then I'll go to Ivan for the next question. His question goes like this. When Magellan came to the Philippines, he missed all the South Pacific Islands. Did he miss all the South Pacific Islands because of these currents and airstreams? And his second question, what stream and current did the Portuguese use to get back from India to Portugal? To get from Portugal to India, did they have to go through Brazil? So those are the questions that he is asking.
Right, and sorry, let's try and deal with these one. The answer to the first question is yes, very clearly. And the sorry, exactly when you read it out, Dave, I said yes, but then I can't remember what it actually was.
I think he's just asking if it was because of the streams and currents that made Magellan miss the South Pacific.
That's basically it. So I mean, because he comes round the Cape Horn, of course, and then picks up the southeast trade winds, and that takes him to Guam. I mean, that's the first island that he actually encounters. So yes, the rest of the Pacific islands are missed because of that, and then the trade winds take him straight to the Philippines. So the answer is yes. It was the existing systems of winds and currents. And the second one is about ships returning from India, Portuguese ships returning from India to Portugal, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, they basically actually just followed the same pattern backwards. They certainly didn't go via the Americas, but they certainly went. They basically followed the same pattern to go back. So I think. October, April, I think they had to leave somewhere around there to catch the monsoons back towards across the Indian Ocean, and then to pick up. It's the monsoons that govern the actual timing, because of course the North Atlantic Gyre and the South Atlantic Gyre are continual wind systems. They're like staples. So it's where you interrelate with the prevailing monsoons that actually dictates the timing of when you go to ensure. And if you missed it, of course, you had to wait an entire season to actually, before you could continue. So, I mean, a ship that left late and missed the sort of prevailing monsoons actually then had to winter in the port where it was until it could actually go on. So journeys could become incredibly long. So a journey, for instance, to the Japans or something could last years if you really timed it badly, or something unfortunate, of course, happened.
Thank you, Greg. Paulo Pinto is raising his hands. Paulo, would you like to ask a question?
Yes, it's just one or two details following what Greg just said. It was one of the causes of the shipwrecks was when the ships left Goa, for instance, too late, and so there was a very rigid time scale and schedule to leave. And so the ships, even from Portugal to India, they had to leave Mozambique at a certain time, at a certain date. I'm not aware exactly of the date because I'm always confusing them, but it was quite scheduled. If they didn't arrive at Mozambique at a certain day, they will have to wait for another monsoon, then to proceed to Goa or to the west coast of India. And about Southeast Asia, I was thinking, when you mentioned the bottleneck, the straits being, for instance, I'm thinking of Malacca. It was a point where several wind regimes mixed.
Yep.
I always would like to think Malacca as a general central station of the 15th and then 16th century, because in the case of Portugal, people that were coming from India, from Portugal, that went to China or to the Moluccas just had to wait for the convenient winds in Malacca, waiting for the next, in the bus stop, waiting for the next travel to the north or to the east. Well, it's quite a modern idea, but looking at Malacca as a huge central station, like a bus station in nowadays, it's an idea quite attractive to me. And that's one of the questions that why we are not able to calculate the population of Malacca. Well, this has nothing to do with the winds, of course, sorry, but the difference of the numbers, if Malacca had 100,000 inhabitants being a huge city or a small city, the difference of the sources is because most of its population was actually in transit, waiting for going to China or going to the Moluccas or the other way, or waiting for transport the other way around. Thank you, sorry.
Oh, I think that's really interesting, Paolo, because I mean, people who, for one reason or another, missed that sort of transfer to the next wind systems. Of course, I mean, having to winter or wait for the next monsoons meant a lot of cultural interaction that was going on, and and I think that's why I find these what I call choke points or maritories really interesting.
Yeah, choke points.
Yeah. Because they are these intersections, and you get all sorts of cultural exchanges going on because of it. Language, culture, trade, war, all these things are being focused on this one spot. But then, what's I'm going way out of period now. But what's really interesting is when you get to the middle to late 19th century, and oil and coal and oil supersede wind is the main motivation or energy for transportation, then the geography of empire changes completely. So islands that were no longer for sailing ships were totally irrelevant suddenly become important as bunkering stations for coal or oil. And you get a completely different geography. And I mean, in the sense, the English / British and French empires, and then the American and Japanese are interesting, but the French and the British, because they actually sort of stride both from that different regime from sail to oil, and how the geography of empire changes with it at the same time. Sorry, I'm rambling on and getting into the 19th century, but it is interesting. Yeah, I call those empires against the wind because they can in the opposite direction.
the empires were free from the winds at last.
Yeah, their empires against the wind. Yeah.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. Well, and it was that notion of the point. My idea. I wrote an article about Malacca being also more than being also a share point because of the strait. It was a limitation. It was a bottleneck, but it was also a point of sharing. So, well, all these notions are quite interesting in the early modern, and now in the early modern. Sorry, and now in the modern era also. Okay, very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Paolo, and thank you, Greg, for your insights. We have one more question for Ivan. Oh, actually, we have two, no? One for Ivan and one for Greg. Let's ask the question first for Ivan. This was sent to me via email. I'll just paraphrase it because it's a bit long. The question basically is, a lot has been said by local Filipino historians with regards to the quality of Philippine hardwoods used in both galleons and Spanish warships. Can these descriptions of the quality of Filipino hardwoods used in ships, can they be independently confirmed by primary sources in Mexico?
By primary sources in Mexico? I'm afraid I don't understand that part of the question.
Can they be independently confirmed by sources over at your end? Because the question says that in local accounts here in the Philippines, a lot has been said about the quality of the Filipino hardwoods used in ships. Since these ships were used in both countries, both in the Philippines and in Manila, can the qualities of these woods, lumber, timber, can they be independently confirmed as if they were really indeed of good quality, or is this more of a local urban legend or phenomenon?
There were indeed careening facilities in Acapulco, and one can assume that local woods from the new Spanish hinterland were used to repair the galleons. In fact, yes, I have found information on the replacement of masts, spars, and the like. So yes, there was a capacity to furnish the ships with local materials in New Spain, although it did not function as a permanent infrastructure. I think that our colleague Guadalupe Pinzon has studied that subject in more detail, and she has proved that in fact there were problems to furnish some materials in Acapulco for fitting out the returning galleons, returning to Manila. On the other hand, we must consider that the main shipbuilding infrastructure was located in the Philippines. So, in fact, the sources are mostly related to the processes that led to the construction and maintenance of the ships in the Philippines, and not necessarily in Spanish America. But as I have said, some historians have already demonstrated that local materials were found when they were needed. That would be the case, for example, of the frigate Santa Rosa, which was seized by the Crown, embargoed by the Crown during the later stages of the 7 Years' War. It was in fact a ship that was being used in the Carrera del Perú. And when the royal officials seized it to send official documentation to the Philippines in the context of the war with England, that ship required quite a lot of materials from the Acapulco hinterland, especially masts and rigging. And of course, it was found, and that was registered in the archive. So there's quite a lot of information on that. But as I have said, the main shipbuilding and maintenance infrastructure was in the Philippines, and the sources are mostly related to its operation.
Thank you, Ivan. We have a question for Dr. Bancroft. Do winds still matter in seafaring today? With all the advances in seafaring technology, is there still a legacy of seafaring from the 16th to the 17th century that continues on today?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, actually. Yes and no is the answer, of course. No, in the sense that actually, even if you're using or not using wind as a source of power, then if you're sailing with the current, of course, you move faster. So, I mean, there is, in that sense, an advantage in going and following wind patterns. What I think is really interesting, of course, is where the future is going to go in terms, and this is probably going much more into Ivan's kind of realm, is with the design of shipbuilding and the return of sail in some capacity as a booster in terms of energy sustainability and decarbonization. So I suspect that actually winds will come back. But the work I'm doing now is actually looking around the Philippines and thinking about wind systems within a certain geographical area. So, I mean, I've been talking about these large scale models of wind systems, but when you actually think of, the actual winds around an archipelago, especially, and I suppose this goes back to an earlier question about complexity of winds and the intricacies there. But, wind is now becoming increasingly a source of energy generation. And I think that's interesting too. So that, in terms of turbines and things like this for wind generation, I think we will see a return to the importance of wind. So maybe actually the age of the empires against the winds and the age of coal and oil will actually be the temporary blip, and that winds will start coming back in a big way in the future.
Thank you, Greg. Ivan, would you like to make a comment on the question that was asked of Dr. Bancroft earlier about the possible legacy of shipbuilding and seafaring that you foresee that continues on today?
Well, I think that many of the techniques that were used on the shipbuilding industry of this period have not wholly disappeared. So there must be a very strong technological legacy in the Philippines today, including not only the use of the hardwoods, but also the traditional techniques for assembling them, the use of the rigging, and in fact, the design of the ships themselves in many ways continues to live in the Philippine shipyards, like, for example, the barangays. So yes, there are many technological aspects from that era that still survive today and that constitute an important cultural and technological legacy.
Thank you, Ivan. Are there any other questions from the members of our Zoom group? If there is none, okay, that concludes our open forum. And but before we end our panel, let's see what's next in the conference series. So to give us a detailed idea of what to expect in the next few weeks, May I call on Dr. Nikki Carci Cruz, Contacts and Continuities Conference's co-convener, to tell us about the upcoming events.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. Sorry. Wow, that discussion was quite long. I feel bad for the speakers. They must be tired, but the conversation will continue tomorrow. You see, we are in part 1 of our 4-part conference. There's still 4 more weeks to go. We started Wednesday last week. Part 1 is on legacies of seafaring and trade, and we are on panel number 4. And tomorrow, we will have the final panel for part 1, which is on environmental history, plants, and food source. Some of the speakers tomorrow are with us in this Zoom room today. No? Dr. Paulina Machuca, Dr. Teresa Nobre de Carvalho is also here. And tomorrow, Dr. Antonio Sanchez de Mora will join them. The Ateneo Institute of Sustainability and Department of Environmental Science will take charge of tomorrow's events, and we will have a continuing conversation related to today, but going in a different route towards plants and food sources. That will be the last panel for seafaring and trade. And starting on Wednesday, we will go to part 2 of our conference. And part 2 will be on legacies of the encounter in ideas and identity formation. We invite the audiences who are joining us from social media. If you want to join this conference, you can still register. The fee is very minimal, only 500 pesos, if you want to get access to the Zoom meetings and to get a conference certificate. But of course, as we saw this week, you need not register to participate because we've had very active participation from people in social media, both in Facebook and in YouTube. It is really our desire to make sure a large audience gets to access all of our panels, not just live, but also afterwards. We're archiving all recordings so that if you miss for any reason, time zone, or you're busy, you can come back and take a look at the panel. So that's an invitation for everyone here as well. If you missed some presentations, you can visit Contacts and Continuities YouTube channel and access the presentations. So on Wednesday, it will be the Ateneo Library of Women's Writings that will be hosting 2 events. First is a keynote by Dr. Barbara Watson Andaya from the University of Hawaii. Since it's already ideas and identity formation, her topic would be on Iberian men and Asian women, legacies of interaction. And quite related to her speech would be the next panel on gender. The speakers are Dr. Vina Lansona, Leal Rodriguez, Dr. Beatriz Alvarez Tardio, and Irene Villascusa Ilian. And they will also be hosted by the Ateneo Library of Women's Writings. So if you want to register, please just go to our website. This is for the public. Just go to our website, and we hope to see you for the rest of the conference. Back to you, Dave. Thank you for giving me some airtime to promote our conference.
Thank you, Nikki. And I must say, this has been most productive and engaging afternoon. I would like to thank Dr. Buvnov and Dr. Bankoff for sharing their time and knowledge with us and sharing their extensive knowledge about the subject to a wider audience, particularly the ones who are viewing us now in social media. I would like to end this afternoon session by quoting from renowned historian Edward Gibbon, because I think it's quite appropriate for the talk of Dr. Bankoff and Ivan. And I'd like to end with this quote: "The wind and the waves are always on the side of the ablest navigator." On behalf of the Department of History and the School of Humanities of the Ateneo de Manila University and our partners, Centro de la Humanidades, Universidade Nova de Lisboa, and the National Quincentennial Commission, I thank all of you for joining us today. Have a pleasant evening. Thank you.